I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard these lines before from Dorothea Mackellar's famous poem, My Country. And so when droughts struck southeastern Australia in the late 1990s, we thought nothing of it. Things would be bad for a year or so, maybe a few years, but then they would largely return to normal as they always did. After all, drought is a normal part of the Australian landscape. By the mid-2000s, the drought had not disappeared. Agricultural productivity was down, the dams were drying out, and we'd had large fires track across the Victorian and southern New South Wales landscape. We were beginning to get into uncharted territory. At this time, I was about midway through my PhD project, examining droughts in the historical record, so looking at rain gauge data. And droughts are not unusual in Australia. At the turn of the 20th century, we had the Federation drought, which lasted for about 5 years. We had an 8-year drought from 1937 to 1945, which unfortunately coincided with World War II. But ultimately, what was now dubbed the Millennium Drought was completely unprecedented. It lasted for 13 years and didn't end until 2010, when summer brought drought-breaking rains. So by this time, scientists were trying to understand the drought in detail. It was unprecedented. What caused it, and was it unusual? And those were big questions. The causes of the drought were very, very difficult to untangle. But that question of, was it unusual? Well, perhaps that's what we could answer. But of course, we only had 100 years of rain gauge data. And looking at a 13-year-long drought with 100 years of data isn't the greatest thing. We don't have a lot there to look at. But was there a way that we could go back further? Well, I discovered there was over lunch with a colleague at a new job that I'd just started. And we decided that we could combine our expertise using an area of study known as paleoclimatology. So paleoclimatology exploits measurable chemical and biological responses of the natural world that are sensitive to changes in climate. In other words, they're nature's rain gauges. So for example, we have trees. Some species, every year that they grow, add an extra ring to the outside of the tree. And depending on whether that year is warm or cold or wet or dry, affects how the tree grows and therefore affects the width of that ring in the tree. And so that can tell us something about the climate. Corals are similar. Corals also put down these growth rings, although corals are sensitive to ocean temperatures and things like salinity, so the saltiness of the ocean. And of course, there's ice cores, which are nature's snow gauges. And in areas like Antarctica, where we don't actually get melting of ice or snow in the summer, every time snow falls, it compacts and we end up getting nice annual layers in an ice core. So perhaps we could use these paleoclimate data that were sensitive to changes in the climate to tell us a bit about southeastern Australian rainfall and this drought that we're in the midst of. So we began gathering data, and scientists had looked at this data before individually for one tree or one piece of coral or one ice core, but what they hadn't looked at was the data collectively, and we thought that that was the key to unlocking the secrets of Southeast Australian drought. But of course, science never did run smooth. We were trying to understand rainfall here in that grey box of southeastern Australia. But we soon discovered that the types of records that we really needed to look at were practically non-existent in this region. And instead, they were here where these dots are. We had a few trees from southwestern Tasmania, but unfortunately, Western Tasmania has a very different climate to the rest of that grey box, so it wasn't necessarily overly useful. So we didn't have the data where we wanted it. But was this a problem? Well, as it turns out, it wasn't, because using the power of collaboration between scientists of different disciplines, we were able to work out that climate processes that affect not just southeastern Australia, but other areas around the globe also affect southeastern Australia. And so we could use that to our advantage. So how can we use data from outside southeastern Australia to tell us about what's going on there? What we use is called atmospheric teleconnections. So what is an atmospheric teleconnection? Basically, you can think about a change in one part of the climate affecting something else downstream. So think about it like throwing a rock in a pond. When you throw a rock in a pond, you get a ripple. That's exactly what's happening in the climate. Now, one of the most famous of these atmospheric teleconnections is called the El Niño Southern Oscillation, the extreme phases of which are El Niño and La Niña, which you may have heard of before. So typically, the atmosphere works to create an area that is usually more conducive to rainfall to the north and east of Australia. There are very warm ocean temperatures there, and so that tends to bring rainfall to the region. But during El Niño, which is one of these extreme phases of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, we get a very distinct pattern of sea surface temperatures, ocean temperatures, in the east and central tropical Pacific. And what this does is has knock-on effects to the atmosphere and changes the winds, changes the circulation to move that area of rainfall further east to the central and eastern Pacific. And so that makes that region, and also Australia, particularly eastern Australia, less conducive to rainfall and makes it less likely to rain during El Niño. And hence, El Niños are usually associated with droughts in southeastern and eastern Australia. But of course, the El Niño Southern Oscillation is not the only teleconnection pattern. There are many others, and these are just three of the major ones. We have the Southern Annular Mode, which tells us how the storms that populate the Southern Ocean move north and south. So those cold fronts and storms that bring rain, sometimes they go further north and sometimes they go further south. And then we have the Indian Ocean Dipole off to the northwest, which also gives us a response kind of like the El Niño Southern Oscillation and makes it more or less likely to rain depending on what state it's in. And interestingly enough, all that paleoclimate data that we had, turns out a lot of it is sensitive to these teleconnection patterns. So changes in the paleoclimate data according to these teleconnection patterns might be able to tell us something about southeastern Australian rainfall. And it turns out that's exactly what we found. And that's shown here. So if we look at the plot on the right, you see areas of blue around southeastern Australia and around southeastern Queensland. Now those areas of blue show us where we have a strong relationship between the common signal in those paleoclimate data, so we use sophisticated statistical techniques to pull out a common signal, and the blue areas here show us where the strongest relationship is. The darker the blue, the stronger the relationship. The map on the left, those red and dark pink areas, shows where the millennium drought was at its worst. Southeastern Australia and southeast Queensland. Exactly where we're seeing that strongest response from the paleoclimate data. And so we were able to use that to our advantage and use that to reconstruct rainfall back in time to see just how unusual the millennium drought was. And that's what we did, and that's what's shown here. So the black line is the best estimate that we could get of southeastern Australian rainfall. And we could reconstruct that. We almost doubled the length of our record, back to 1783, providing an extra 120 odd years of data. So that's what the black line is. The grey shading shows some uncertainty around that because obviously these are estimates from natural things like trees and ice, so they're not going to be perfect. There's some uncertainty around it. But what the green and red line shows are two different networks of rainfall stations, so actual gauge data that we've read. And you can see how closely the red and the green follow the black line, even as far back in time as we can get. And so we were fairly confident that our black line is a pretty decent estimate of what actually happened to rainfall way back from 1783. What we could also do is collaborate with non-scientists. We actually talked to historians as well, environmental historians, who had been studying early settlers around southeastern Australia. And one of the records that we looked at was a record from a place called Lake George, which is not too far from Canberra. Now, this lake is very sensitive to rainfall and basically acts like a big rain gauge. So it fills up when it rains a lot and it dries out when we've got drought. And if you look at that record, what you find is things like this. In 1824, the record describes Lake George as being completely full and a wall of water. Whereas in 1838, by that stage, the lake had dried out completely. And in fact, they described that you could drive a team straight through it. In other words, a team of horses. So the lake was completely dry. So that also gives us some additional evidence that what we're seeing here likely did happen. So what does that mean for the Millennium Drought? So the Millennium Drought, you can see at the very end of that red time series, up towards the far right. That lowest point is the Millennium Drought. And compared to the longer historical record, you can see that it's certainly unusual, but not necessarily completely outside what we have seen in the past. The results are a bit ambiguous. They're not exactly what we were hoping to find. Of course, nothing in science ever is, right? So it certainly tells us that the Millennium Drought is at the edge of our past experience, but not necessarily completely unprecedented. And this tells us a couple of things. This can tell us that perhaps we should expect droughts like the Millennium Drought to occur in the future. Okay? But it also shows us that they don't happen all the time, which is also a good thing. So if we look at the Millennium Drought, is it unusual? Well, the answer is actually maybe. We're not sure yet, and it's still an area of very active research and a work in progress. People are looking at the causes of drought, and people are trying to see in longer term records, using techniques similar to this, whether it really is unusual. But of course, we can look at the more recent record as well. As I said, the Millennium Drought ended in 2010. And we can look at ongoing data. And that's what's shown here. This is from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. And here the red bars show rainfall below average, and the blue bars show rainfall above average. Now, this is for what we call the southern wet season. So pretty much autumn, winter, and early spring rainfall. And this is for southeastern Australia in the same area where we had the Millennium Drought. You can see the Millennium Drought throughout the early 2000s, and you can see 2010 as the one lone blue bar well above the line. But what you can also see is that since 2010, we've reverted back to a very dry period. And that's something, as a drought scientist, that I'm certainly keeping an eye on. Thank you.